Today's story is called The Old Receipt Mr. Ellis Found from Years Ago. Welcome to Warm Life Stories, a quiet little corner where we slow down, breathe a little easier, and share gentle stories about ordinary people living ordinary days that somehow still touch the heart. If you enjoy quiet stories like this, feel free to subscribe or share your thoughts in the comments. We always love reading them. Now, if you're ready, let's settle in and gently step into today's story. The morning opened quietly, as if the world was taking a slow, patient breath before beginning its day. A soft light settled across Mr. Ellis's porch, touching the wooden boards with the same familiarity as an old friend. The air held a cool hint of early spring, gentle, uncertain, lingering just long enough to be felt. Down the street, a single bird called out, its voice unhurried, drifting through the stillness like a reminder that the day was waking up in its own time. Mr. Ellis sat in his usual chair, the one on the right, the one Maggie teased him about for years. He still insisted it had the better view, though everyone knew the two chairs sat side by side, nearly touching. His chipped mug rested in his hands, warm against his palms. He traced the faint crack near the handle with his thumb, the way he always did, as if the small imperfections steadied him somehow. The porch wasn't empty. It was simply quiet. And quiet, to Mr. Ellis, never meant loneliness. It meant the world was alive, but softly, gently, as if respecting the slowness of a man who had lived long enough to appreciate mornings exactly like this. He leaned back slightly, letting the weight of his body coax a familiar creak from the porch boards. The sound rose and faded like a memory, one of those worn, comfortable ones you don't need to revisit often because they already live somewhere inside you. A light breeze brushed across his sleeve, stirred the edge of the porch rail, then drifted upward, carrying with it the faint scent of dew. Dust that he meant to wipe later lifted for a moment before settling again. The breeze seemed to whisper its own suggestion. Not yet. Sit a little longer. Behind him, from the half-open doorway, a soft rattle echoed through the quiet house, something shifting in a drawer, a stack of old letters leaning against each other, or maybe just the old frame settling into the day. Mr. Ellis didn't turn. Houses like his made their own kind of morning music, and after years of living alone, he had come to understand every small sound. Toby, the stray cat who chose him and never left, stretched lazily near the step. The cat blinked slowly, approving of the calm, before curling back into a tight, warm circle. Even Toby had learned that this hour belonged to stillness. Mr. Ellis lifted his mug and took a slow sip. The steam rose in a thin, wavering line before disappearing into the pale light. He watched it fade and felt that familiar softness settle over him, the feeling that sat somewhere between peace and a quiet ache. Not sadness. Not exactly. More like the gentle weight of a memory brushing against the edges of a new day. He looked out over the neighborhood. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. And yet, something felt different. The morning had a quiet expectancy to it, as if holding a small truth the day hadn't revealed yet. His eyes drifted to a small wooden table beside him. An old wooden box sat there. The same box Maggie once used to keep small scraps of life receipts, tiny notes, pressed flowers, things she called heart keepers. Over time, he had added a few of his own. Not out of sentiment, at least not the way Maggie meant it, more because he never quite knew where else to put things he didn't want to lose. He had taken the box out earlier, intending to tidy it. But tidying required intention, and this morning seemed to ask only for gentleness. The breeze returned slightly stronger now and nudged the lid of the box. It lifted just a hair, then tapped lightly as it settled back into place. Wood touching wood in the quiet. Mr. Ellis looked toward it. Not with urgency, not with worry. Just a quiet recognition, the kind that happens when something small asks to be seen. He didn't reach for the box yet. He didn't open it. He simply let the moment rest beside him, breathing in sync with the slow, easy rhythm of the porch. Life, he had learned, rarely hurried its meaningful things. Inside that box, beneath layers of paper and time, something waited. Something he had forgotten, not because it lacked importance, but because some memories choose their moment to return. And on this soft, lingering morning, with the world still half asleep, Mr. Ellis felt without needing to understand why that the moment had come. The morning light shifted, just enough for Mr. Ellis to notice the quiet shimmer along the porch rail. It was the kind of subtle change that would escape most people, but not him. He had spent years learning the pace of slow mornings, years letting the light tell him what time it was more reliably than any clock. He reached over and adjusted the sleeve of his flannel shirt, a familiar, almost unconscious motion. Age had slowed his movements, but in a way that carried a sort of grace. Nothing hurried, nothing strained. Everything deliberate, as though his body had made peace with time. At 74, Mr. Ellis had come to appreciate the gentleness of small routines. Boiling water the old-fashioned way, choosing the same mug every morning, settling into the same porch chair. These rituals held him together in a world that moved faster than he preferred. They reminded him that life didn't need to be large to be meaningful. It only needed to be steady. A soft voice called from across the fence. "Morning, Harold." Mrs. Harper's wave floated into view before she did. She appeared a moment later with her usual cheerful brightness, gray hair pinned neatly, a light sweater draped over her shoulders despite the mild weather. At 72, she moved with a surprising buoyancy, as though her spirit insisted on lifting her through the day. Mr. Ellis lifted his mug slightly in greeting, the closest he ever came to waving before finishing his coffee. Mrs. Harper understood. She always had. Some neighbors demand attention. She simply offered presence. "Looks like a quiet one today," she said, leaning on the fence. Mr. Ellis nodded. "Quiet's not a bad thing. That's what I like about this street," she replied before heading back toward her garden. Her humming drifted after her, a soft, familiar melody he couldn't quite place, but one that always made the morning feel warmer. Toby wandered over then, brushing lightly against Mr. Ellis's leg. The cat wasn't needy, just mindful, in that instinctive way animals sometimes are. Mr. Ellis reached down, running a gentle hand along Toby's back. The cat responded with a slow blink, as if offering approval for the morning's serenity. From down the road came the faint rumble of a mail truck, a sound as predictable as the sunrise. Mr. Clark, the neighborhood mailman, would be making his way toward them soon, moving door to door with the quiet ease of someone who knew every house, every porch, every dog's name. He and Mr. Ellis shared a simple routine, a nod, a smile, a brief exchange about the weather. Nothing more, nothing less. Sometimes the only conversations that mattered were the ones that asked nothing in return. Mr. Ellis took another slow sip of coffee. The warmth traveled through him, settling into the spaces age had carved out, those soft, empty places only morning rituals seemed to fill. He looked down at the old box again, resting on the small table beside him. It had belonged to Maggie once. She kept everything: ticket stubs, dried leaves, handwritten notes, and tiny pieces of life he would have thrown away without thinking. She insisted memories needed places to rest, just like people. His gaze softened. He could almost see her hands capable, gentle tucking things into the box with quiet intention. Maggie never tried to teach him lessons, yet somehow she taught him everything that mattered. A breeze swept through the porch, carrying the faint scent of someone brewing coffee a few houses away. It was a comforting smell, familiar and grounding. It reminded him of early years with Maggie, two young people sitting by a tiny kitchen window, planning their days without knowing how quickly time would learn to outrun them. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the memory come and go without resistance. When he opened them, the neighborhood was beginning to stir. A cyclist passing by, a dog tugging its owner down the sidewalk, a window opening somewhere with the clink of glass. Ordinary things, beautiful in their ordinariness. And through it all, the wooden box remained exactly where it was, quiet, patient, waiting. Mr. Ellis reached out and rested a hand on its lid. Not to open it, not yet, just a gentle touch, the way one might acknowledge an old friend before speaking. Whatever waited inside, it had been there for years. Another minute wouldn't change that. But something inside Mr. Ellis was shifting slowly, quietly making room for whatever memory was ready to return. The breeze lingered around the porch a moment longer, as if encouraging Mr. Ellis to lift the lid of the box. But instead of opening it, he let his hand rest atop the smooth wood. Touch alone was enough to stir something inside him, something soft, like the echo of a familiar tune he hadn't heard in years. He exhaled slowly. Memories didn't always arrive in full scenes. Sometimes they came in thin strands, light, scent, a color, a sound, and then settled quietly into place. And on this gentle morning, they began to unfold almost on their own. He remembered a warm afternoon decades ago, sunlight spilling through the wide windows of a small cafe on Maple Street. Maggie was sitting across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she never finished. She always ordered it, though. "Tea helps me think," she used to say. But she spent most of the time talking, her ideas spilling out in that bright, earnest way he loved. He could still see the way the sunlight touched her hair that day, soft, golden, almost playful. She laughed at something he said, something small and probably not very funny, yet she laughed as though the moment itself was enough. That laugh had a way of filling the room, and filling him. Mr. Ellis smiled faintly, the memory settling gently into the quiet of the porch. Another memory followed, drifting in like a leaf carried on wind. It was autumn. Not the dramatic kind, the gentle kind that slips quietly between days. The two of them had gone for a walk behind the old library, where the path curved beneath tall oaks. Maggie had stopped to pick up a tiny acorn. "A keeper," she whispered, placing it in his palm. Every day should have at least one little keeper. He never understood why that moment stayed with him. They must have walked that path 100 times, but that small acorn, smooth, ordinary, resting in his hand, felt like a promise he hadn't known he was receiving. He wondered now if that acorn was in the box. Maggie had a habit of saving things he thought too small to matter. But she had a way of seeing meaning where others saw nothing at all. The breeze shifted again, carrying the distant sound of children laughing, probably on their way to school. The sound blended into another layer of memory, one that arrived so quietly he almost missed it. Early evening, rain tapping lightly against their kitchen window, the smell of Maggie's casserole filling the small house. She hummed as she cooked, moving with the ease of someone who knew the kitchen the way a painter knows a palette. He had been fixing a loose drawer that night, listening to her hum without realizing how deeply he was memorizing the sound. He hadn't thought of that moment in years. And yet here it was clear, warm, whole, as if the years had thinned just enough for him to reach through. He took another breath, slower this time. Time had softened, so many details, faces of old neighbors, the layout of places that no longer existed, the sound of streets that had changed. But Maggie, certain memories of her stayed sharp in all the right ways, not painful, not haunting, just present, waiting quietly in the corners of ordinary mornings like this. His fingers tapped lightly on the lid of the wooden box. There were memories inside it too, he knew that. Not the big ones, not anniversaries or celebrations or moments people tell stories about. Maggie never saved those. She saved the moments no one else would have noticed. A stray flower petal from a walk, a napkin with a sentence scribbled on it, a faded leaf shaped like a heart, a list of groceries that somehow turned into a tiny piece of their life. He felt something tighten gently in his chest, not sadness, just the deep awareness of how much life is built out of small things. The little keeps Maggie believed in so strongly. The morning light shifted again, sliding across the porch floor until it reached the leg of his chair. The brightness nudged him a bit closer to the present, but the memories didn't fade. They lingered, folding around him like an old, familiar quilt. Mr. Ellis let his hand drift away from the box. He wasn't quite ready to open it. Not yet. The memories had begun speaking on their own, and for now, he simply wanted to listen. The sun had climbed just a little higher now, warming the porch boards beneath Mr. Ellis's feet. Morning sounds drifted in one by one, distant footsteps, a mailbox closing somewhere down the street, the quiet roll of Mr. Clark's mail truck turning the corner. The neighborhood was waking up in its usual, gentle rhythm. Mr. Ellis shifted slightly in his chair, feeling the familiar ache in his knees, an ache that reminded him he had lived long enough to give his days the right kind of attention. He glanced again at the wooden box. For a long moment, he simply looked at it, the way one might look at something fragile before choosing to hold it. Then, with the care of someone opening a memory rather than an object, he lifted the lid. Inside, the contents lay almost exactly as he remembered, though time had softened their edges. Small papers folded into half, faint ink marks, a few items Maggie had saved decades ago. Everything rested as though it had been waiting for this morning. He reached for the top layer, a small collection of tiny notes Maggie had written. Back soon. Don't forget milk. Morning sunshine. Simple, but her handwriting carried a warmth nothing else could mimic. He placed them gently beside him. Beneath the notes was a pressed leaf, thin and brittle, tucked between two pieces of cardstock. It must have been from that autumn walk near the library, the one where she picked up the acorn. He brushed his finger lightly across it, careful not to break the fragile stem. But it wasn't the leaf that caught his attention. It was something hidden beneath, half-slipped between old receipts and folded napkins. A small rectangle of yellowed paper. It looked ordinary at first, just another scrap Maggie had saved. But the moment he pulled it free, the air around him seemed to shift, the way it does when a long-forgotten moment suddenly steps back into the room. It was a receipt. Faded, thin, edges worn soft from time. And at the top, barely legible now, was the name of a place he hadn't thought about in years. Maple Street Cafe. A breath left him quiet, steady, almost startled in its softness. Of all the things Maggie had saved, of all the tiny scraps of life she tucked away, this one felt different. Not because of the cafe itself, but because of what that place had meant. The receipt was from a day he thought he remembered clearly, yet holding it now awakened a layer he hadn't expected. The date stamped near the top made his chest tighten, not painfully, just with a slow, deep pull. It was from their 40th anniversary, a day he thought had been simple, ordinary, beautiful in a quiet way. He remembered the walk there, Maggie's arm tucked into his, her steps slightly slower than they once were. She teased him for ordering the same thing every time, and he teased her back for doing exactly the same. They'd sat at a small corner table near the window, the one with the squeaky leg. The waitress apologized, but Maggie had laughed and said, "Some things squeak so we don't forget they're there." It had been a light-hearted day, not a grand celebration, just the two of them choosing to be together the way they always had. But now, holding the receipt, Mr. Ellis noticed something he had never seen before, something written in soft pencil along the margin in Maggie's neat, rounded handwriting. "For all our mornings together." He stared at the words as though they were a doorway back into the moment itself. Maggie must have written it when he wasn't looking. She had always done things like that, quiet gestures that didn't demand attention. She left meaning in places she knew he would eventually stumble upon, long after she was gone, when the world felt slow and he felt ready. He ran a thumb gently along the fading handwriting. It felt like touching a memory that had somehow stayed warm. A breeze moved through the porch, lifting the edge of the receipt just slightly, as though encouraging him to look deeper, so he turned it over. On the back was another line, smaller, almost hidden in the crease of the fold. 2 coffees, 1 shared moment. He blinked, the air around him stilling. Maggie always believed that the smallest moments were the ones life was built on. And here she was again, reminding him in the softest way possible. He placed the receipt on his lap, letting the weight of it settle into his morning. Nothing dramatic had happened, just a discovery, quiet, unexpected, deeply human. Yet the moment felt different, as if the day had opened something gently inside him, something that had been waiting a very long time. Mr. Ellis held the receipt a moment longer, letting the soft graphite letters settle into him. The handwriting was unmistakably Maggie's, rounded, steady, a little tilted to the right, as if even her pen strokes were leaning toward warmth. He traced the words again, slower this time. "For all our mornings together." It was such a simple sentence, but simplicity had always been Maggie's way of saying something true. He lifted the receipt closer to the light. The sun hit it at a different angle now, revealing faint indentations, marks he hadn't noticed earlier. Maggie had pressed hard enough for her pencil to leave grooves along the paper. That alone made his chest tighten a little. She must have written it with intention, maybe while he stepped outside to stretch his legs or refill their water glasses. He turned the paper over once more, the edges whispering against his fingertips. The second line, 2 coffees, 1 shared moment, felt even smaller, as though she hadn't meant for anyone to see it but had written it anyway, because the moment had meant enough to be kept. Mr. Ellis leaned back in his chair, the creek beneath him blending with a warm memory rising in his mind. He remembered that afternoon more clearly now. They had sat by the window, watching people pass by on Maple Street. Maggie had pointed out a young couple holding hands, whispering that they reminded her of the two of them, a long, long time ago, when your hair was still thick and my patience was still short. He chuckled at the memory. Maggie's jokes always hit softly, with affection hidden beneath the humor. He remembered how she looked at him just before they left the cafe, her eyes softened in that way that always made him feel as though she was seeing more than he ever said. He had never asked what she was thinking. He always believed there would be more mornings, more afternoons, more quiet cafes where he could ask her later. And yet here he was answering a question she had left behind instead. He exhaled, letting the morning air fill the spaces the memory had reopened. On the porch rail, a small shadow flickered. A sparrow had landed there, tilting its head toward him as if curious about the scrap of paper in his hands. The tiny bird hopped closer, its feathers puffed against the soft breeze. For a moment, the world felt unusually still. Mr. Ellis, the sparrow, the faint pencil words, all sharing the same breath of quiet. Maggie would have liked you, he murmured under his breath, not expecting the bird to understand. It didn't, of course, but it lingered a second longer before fluttering away. That small visit left the air feeling strangely lighter. He turned his attention back to the receipt. Something about it felt unfinished, like a sentence missing its second half. He ran his fingers along the edge again, and that was when he noticed it. A tiny fold, barely there, almost invisible. He unfolded it gently, careful not to tear the fragile paper. Inside the fold was a small check mark, just one, slanted, deliberate. Next to a short printed line on the receipt that read, Table No. 5. Mr. Ellis blinked. Table 5. He knew that table. He remembered the chair with the loose leg, the little crack in the tabletop running like a faded river. He remembered how Maggie used to circle her finger around that crack whenever she was deep in thought. He remembered her saying it looked like a tiny road that leads somewhere kind. And now, she had marked it, quietly, softly, without telling him. It wasn't a message, not a secret, just a small noticing, something Maggie had always done. He felt the memory unfold a little more. That day, their anniversary, Maggie had lingered at the table after he stood up to leave. He had thought she was looking for her scarf, or maybe just taking in the view a moment longer. But now he wondered if she had been memorizing the tiny details, table number, sunlight angle, the warmth between them, so that later she could fold that memory carefully into this box. He inhaled, slow and steady. The receipt wasn't just a scrap she saved. It was a moment she wanted him to find again someday. Mr. Ellis closed his eyes briefly, letting the realization land softly inside him, like a small cup being set gently on a table. He folded the receipt back exactly the way Maggie had, smoothing the crease with his thumb. Then he placed it on the wooden table beside him, not back in the box, but out in the light, where it felt like it belonged for now. The breeze swept across the porch, lifting the corner of the receipt once more before letting it settle. The air felt warm, almost tender. Sometimes the smallest discoveries were the ones that changed the day. And this morning, something in Mr. Ellis's heart had shifted a little lighter, a little clearer. He didn't know what would come next, but the receipt had opened a door, gently, quietly, and he was ready to step toward whatever memory waited behind it. The receipt lay on the small table beside him, its edges lifting ever so slightly each time the breeze wandered across the porch. It didn't look like anything special from a distance, just a thin, yellowed scrap of paper resting in a pool of morning light. But to Mr. Ellis, it felt heavier than anything he had held in a long while. Not heavy in a painful way. Heavy the way memories can be, quiet, full, settling somewhere deep inside the chest. He sat with it for a while, letting the air move gently around him. A few leaves rustled near the steps. A car rolled quietly down the street. The world continued as it always did, unaware that something small but meaningful had shifted in the life of an old man on a quiet porch. Mr. Ellis reached for the receipt again. This time, he didn't examine it. He didn't read the words or search for more hidden notations. He simply held it in both hands, the way one might hold a fragile keepsake passed down through generations. His fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but from the tender steadiness of the moment. The sunlight touched the paper just right, illuminating the crease Maggie had folded, the faint pencil marks, the ghost of her handwriting. And suddenly, without warning, a warmth rose in his throat. Not tears, not sorrow, just warmth, pure, steady, rising from a place inside him he rarely visited. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he wasn't 74. He wasn't sitting alone on a weathered porch. He wasn't holding a piece of paper worn thin by time. He was back in that cafe 40 years into a life with Maggie, sunlight touching her hair, her smile soft and familiar, the sound of cups clinking softly around them. He saw the small laugh she gave when the waitress apologized for the wobbly table. He felt her hand brush lightly against his as she reached for her tea. He remembered the way she had looked at him as they stood to leave, an expression he hadn't recognized then, but understood now. A look that seemed to say, "Remember this, remember us, remember the small things." The memory wrapped around him with a gentleness that surprised him. He opened his eyes again, slowly. The porch returned the light, the quiet air. Toby curled like a soft shadow near his feet, but something inside him had softened, as though a tight knot he didn't know he was carrying had quietly loosened. He placed the receipt back on his lap, smoothing its surface with the flat of his hand. His breathing calmed, his shoulders lowered. There was a steadiness in him that hadn't been there moments before. A feeling came over him, not sharp, not overwhelming, more like the feeling of finally hearing the last note of a long-forgotten song, a sense of completion, of closeness. He whispered into the quiet, barely louder than the breeze, "Thank you, Maggie." The words didn't carry sadness. They carried gratitude, warm, sincere, and filled with the years they had shared. He didn't expect an answer, but the wind shifted just then, brushing against his cheek with a softness he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't a sign, not exactly, just a gentle reminder that some things remain with us, even when the world insists they're gone. Across the street, Mrs. Harper's wind chimes began to ring, a soft, delicate sound that drifted through the air like a blessing. The tones blended with the morning sounds, filling the porch with a kind of quiet music. Mr. Ellis closed his eyes again, letting the chimes wash over him. Inside his chest, something light unfolded. Not joy, exactly, not peace alone. Something between them, something soft and steady, the kind of feeling that makes breathing feel easier. He looked down at the receipt once more and reached for the small drawer built into the side of the porch table. He hadn't used it in years. It stuck a little before opening, the wood groaning softly as it slid forward. Inside was nothing but dust and one forgotten pencil. He placed the receipt inside, flat, uncreased, cared for. Not to hide it, not to let go of it, but to give it a place. Some memories aren't meant to be tucked away in boxes. Some are meant to rest close, within reach, where the heart can return to them whenever the morning feels quiet enough. Mr. Ellis closed the drawer gently, letting the soft click be the final note of the moment. And for the first time in a long while, he felt lighter. The drawer closed with a soft, final click, so quiet it almost disappeared into the morning air. Yet for Mr. Ellis, the sound settled inside him like the closing of a gentle chapter. Not an ending, just a pause, a resting place. He let his hand linger on the wooden table for a moment, feeling the warmth left by the sunlight. Something in him felt different now, subtle, like the way a room feels after someone opens a window and lets in fresh air. Not a change anyone else could see, but one he could feel in the way his shoulders loosened, in the steadiness of his breath. He took another sip from his mug. Though the coffee had cooled, it didn't matter. Warmth, he realized, didn't always come from temperature. Across the street, Mrs. Harper stepped out into her yard, holding a small watering can that looked too light to be full. She waved when she saw him, bright, cheerful, the way she always did. Most mornings, he would simply nod back, but today, he lifted his hand a little higher, letting the gesture linger in the air. Mrs. Harper's smile widened, and she returned to her flowers with a contented hum. Mr. Ellis let his gaze drift to the street. The world, in its small ways, was waking. the faint rumble of a garbage truck in the distance, a teenager on a bicycle gliding by with headphones on, the clack of a dog's nails on the sidewalk. Nothing remarkable, yet everything familiar. The kind of ordinary that made life feel grounded. He reached down and gave Toby a soft scratch behind the ears. The cat stretched, blinked up at him with slow affection, then hopped onto his lap, settling into a warm curl. Toby didn't climb up often, not unless he sensed something different about the morning. Animals, Mr. Ellis thought, had their own quiet wisdom. With the cat's weight resting comfortably against him, Mr. Ellis leaned back, letting the porch cradle him. He watched sunlight spill through the maple tree in the yard, each breeze sending soft glittering patterns across the grass. The day felt lighter than it had in a long time. For the first time in months, he found himself thinking not of what he had lost, but of what he still carried. Memories that hadn't dimmed, love that hadn't faded, mornings like this that still offered small grace, if he paused long enough to notice. He looked toward the street just in time to see Mr. Clark's mail truck pull up. The mailman gave his usual polite nod, but today Mr. Ellis stood slowly, carefully, and walked the few steps down to meet him. It wasn't far, but the motion felt meaningful in a way he couldn't quite name. "Morning, Harold," Mr. Clark said, handing him a thin stack of envelopes. "Morning," Mr. Ellis replied, his voice steady and warm. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" The mailman paused, surprised at the unusually conversational tone. Then he smiled. "It is, one of the better ones." Mr. Ellis nodded, and for a brief moment, they simply stood in the soft morning light, two ordinary men sharing an unspoken acknowledgement that some days felt kinder than others. As the truck rolled away, Mr. Ellis held the mail loosely at his side. Nothing urgent, nothing demanding his attention, just the usual checks, newsletters, and quietly expected things. He walked back to the porch, each step slow but sure. Toby followed at his heels, weaving between his legs with a gentle insistence that everything was exactly as it should be. Back at his chair, he sat once more, placing the mail on the small table. His eyes drifted toward the drawer where he had placed the receipt. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Knowing it was there close, safe, resting was enough. The wind picked up suddenly, lifting the edge of the porch curtain and carrying the faint scent of someone baking down the block. Cinnamon, maybe, or apple. A smell that traveled through the air like a soft reminder of the goodness tucked quietly into ordinary days. Mr. Ellis breathed it in. Then, without really thinking about it, he spoke into the quiet morning, just a whisper, more to himself than to anyone else. "I think I'll be all right." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't meant to be. They simply rose from a place inside him that felt steadier than it had in a long while. He reached for his mug again and watched the light move across the porch, slow and patient. Nothing remarkable had changed. And yet, everything felt a little different. Sometimes healing didn't arrive with answers or revelations. Sometimes it came in the form of a quiet morning, a faded receipt, a familiar chair, and the steady understanding that life still held gentle things. The morning had grown brighter, but not in a way that pushed the day forward. It was the kind of brightness that lingered softly, spreading itself across the porch in patient, unhurried strokes. Mr. Ellis watched the light shift and settle, as though the world were turning a page slowly enough for him to follow every line. Toby curled in a half-moon shape near his feet, purring in a steady rhythm. The sound was faint, almost blending into the hum of the neighborhood. A few doors down, someone laughed, a brief, warm sound carried on the breeze. And somewhere beyond the maple tree, he could hear children calling to one another, their voices bright and free in the late morning air. Life was moving, quietly, easily, exactly as it always had. But inside him, something had settled differently. Mr. Ellis leaned back in his chair, letting his hands rest loosely on the armrests. His shoulders had dropped into a posture of calm he hadn't felt in months, perhaps years. He glanced toward the drawer where the receipt now rested, tucked away but not out of reach. He didn't need to open it again. The feeling it stirred was still with him, warm and steady, like a small ember glowing softly beneath the surface. He looked up at the sky. A single, thin cloud drifted by slow, unfussed, carried by a wind that knew where it was going even if no one else did. Maybe, he thought, memories were carried the same way. Not by force, not by effort, just by time, and by the quiet willingness to let them find their place. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape the world, but to settle more deeply into it. The warmth of the sun on his face reminded him of summer mornings long ago, when he and Maggie would sit on this same porch before the day asked anything of them. Back then, he never thought about how rare those moments were, how fragile, how quietly precious. He simply lived them, trusting there would be another and another after that. He opened his eyes again. A small part of him wished he could go back, just for a minute, to sit across from Maggie in that cafe, to watch her trace the crack in the table with her finger, to hear her laugh softly about something ordinary. But the wish didn't ache the way it once would have. Instead, it settled like a soft memory resting in the corner of a warm room. He lifted his mug and took a slow sip. Though the coffee had grown cold, the taste didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling, the quiet companionship of a moment lived without hurry. His gaze drifted across the yard, to the place where sunlight filtered through the branches of the old maple tree. The leaves shimmered as the breeze moved through them, each one catching the light for just a second before giving way to the next. He thought about how life worked, much the same way. Moments shining, fading, giving way to others. Not disappearing, just moving into a different kind of light. He let out a long, slow breath. Maybe that was what Maggie had been trying to leave him, not just a receipt, not just a phrase scribbled in pencil, but a reminder that love didn't vanish when the moment passed. It simply changed form, shifted, settled into the parts of a life that were still unfolding. He looked toward the porch railing, where the breeze tugged lightly at a loose thread on the cushion beside him. The air felt softer now, almost tender. "Funny," he said to no one in particular, voice calm, almost thoughtful. "You think you forget things? And then a small piece of paper proves you didn't forget it all." Toby lifted his head at the sound of his voice, blinked once, then rested again. Mr. Ellis smiled. He wasn't sure what the rest of the day would bring, maybe a visit from Tommy, maybe a short walk around the block, maybe nothing at all. But as he sat there in the warm hush of late morning, he felt a quiet certainty settle around him. He wasn't alone in his memories. He never had been. He let the sunlight touch his hands, gentle and steady. "Some moments," he whispered, "stay with us longer than we know." The wind carried the words away, not quickly, not forcefully, just softly enough to let them drift into the day, where they belonged. Mr. Ellis leaned back, breathing in the quiet. The world felt lighter, and for the first time in a long time, he felt light with it. The morning closed itself gently around him, like a soft hand resting on his shoulder. And somewhere deep inside, where memories lived without growing old, he felt Maggie's presence not as a shadow, not as an ache, but as something warm and steady, a reminder that even the smallest things can carry us forward.